In this section, we test the connection between politicians and their followers, as mediated through camera shots during the 2020 presidential election. We look at the production decisions regarding the time given candidates and the types of camera shots they receive. This gives us an idea as to the treatment of frontrunners and all other candidates, as well as how they might be perceived by the viewing public. Here, I go over findings from a study I carried out with the University of Arkansas PhD student Austin Eubanks and the then undergraduate students Nick Hersom and Cooper Hearn. This study replicates one I carried out 4 years previously with Austin Eubanks and Jason Miller, who is now a Kansas University psychology PhD student, when they were both undergraduates. That study content analyzed the initial two 2016 presidential primary debates for both the Democratic and Republican parties in terms of visual priming and visual framing. What is different is that with 20 Democratic Party presidential candidates in 2020, 2 nights of debates hosted by NBC, MSNBC, and Telemundo were held to make room for all eligible candidates. An estimated 2,000 individuals were present at the Adrienne Arsht Center for Performing Arts in Miami, Florida, for each of the nights it was held in late June of 2019. To be eligible to take part in these initial contests, candidates had to receive donations from 65,000 unique donors from at least 20 states, or poll at least 1% or better in at least 3 national surveys or surveys held in at the first 4 primary and caucus states of Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, or Nevada. But that still left the question as to how to divide the candidates across the nights, which led to perhaps the most interesting experiment of all. To ensure as much fairness as possible, candidates were split into top-tier and second-tier candidates and randomly assigned to different nights. 8 top-tier candidates polling at more than 2% were randomly divided across the nights, with the remaining lower-tier candidates randomly assigned to one of the 2 debate nights. This means that electoral status could potentially play a major role in how candidates are visually primed and visually framed. With this study, we considered different ways of operationalizing electoral status. We asked, will candidates who are the top 2 candidates on stage receive more visual attention and better visual frames? Or will production choices be influenced by different forms of electoral status, such as how close to the center of the stage a candidate is, or whether the candidate is a top-tier candidate by being in the overall top 8 and top 4 for that night, or whether candidates will get more and better coverage based upon their polling percentages. We saw that what was the case in 2016 was that the top 2 candidates for each party, whether Donald Trump and Jeb Bush for the Republican Party or Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders for the Democratic Party, received the most time and best camera shots. Here we see that Trump and Bush were far and away the priming and framing recipients for the GOP, despite there being 10 candidates on stage for the Fox News debate and 11 candidates for the CNN debate. Clinton and Sanders likewise stood out, although with 5 candidates during the CNN debate and only 3 during the CBS debate, there were not as many candidates to focus the camera on. As we can see from the slide, there is an overall pattern of top-tier candidates receiving more camera time in the 2020 Democratic Party presidential primary debates. There was no easily discernible pattern, however. For instance, Beto O'Rourke was on camera for nearly 27 minutes, 2 minutes more than Elizabeth Warren, while Cory Booker had 1 more minute camera time than Warren did, despite her being an early prohibitive favorite. On the other hand, during the second night, Joe Biden had 5 minutes more camera time than did Bernie Sanders, and at 33 minutes total, he outpaced all other candidates by a substantial margin. When it comes to being shown in the solo shot, we see a similar pattern of frontrunners, O'Rourke, Booker, and then Warren dominating time and head and shoulder shots during the first night. On the second night, Biden was far and away the candidate shown most in the shot, but, rather interestingly, Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg, and Kamala Harris spent roughly the same amount of time in this shot. The multi-candidate shot, providing some support for the inference that front-runners would spend the least amount of time in this group shot, while also-rans would spend more of their time there, as seen by Jay Inslee and Andrew Yang. In this video clip, which lasts around 5 minutes, we see a combination of solo, side-by-side, and multiple candidate shots as the Democratic Party nominee Joe Biden and Kamala Harris debate each other over civil rights.
There is not a black man I know, be he a relative, a friend, or a coworker, who has not been the subject of some form of profiling or discrimination. Growing up, my sister and I had to deal with the neighbor who told us her parents couldn't play with us because we were black. And I will say also that in this campaign, we've also heard, and I'm going to now direct this at Vice President Biden, I do not believe you are a racist. And I agree with you when you commit yourself to the importance of finding common ground. But I also believe, and it's personal, and I was actually it was hurtful to hear you talk about the reputations of two United States senators who built their reputations and career on the segregation of race in this country. And it was not only that, but you also worked with them to oppose busing. And, you know, there was a little girl in California who was part of the second class to integrate her public schools. And she was bused to school every day. And that little girl was me. So I will tell you that on this subject, it cannot be an intellectual debate among Democrats. We have to take it seriously. We have to act swiftly. As Attorney General of California, I was very proud to put in place a requirement that all my special agents would wear body cameras and keep those cameras on.
Senator Harris, thank you. Vice President Biden, you have been invoked. We are going to give you a chance to respond. Vice President Biden.
It's a mischaracterization of my position across the board. I did not praise racist. That is not true, number one. Number two, if we want to have this campaign litigated on who supports civil rights and whether I did or not, I'm happy to do that. I was a public defender. I didn't become a prosecutor. I came out and I left a good law firm to become a public defender when in fact my city was in flames because of the assassination of Dr. King. Number one. Now, number two, as the Vice President of the United States, I work with a man who, in fact, we worked very hard to see to it we dealt with these issues in a major, major way. The fact is that in terms of busing, the busing, you would have been able to go to school the same exact way because it was a local decision made by your city council. That's fine. That's one of the things I argued for, that we should be breaking down these lines. But so the bottom line here is, look, everything I've done in my career, I ran because of civil rights. I continue to think we have to make fundamental changes in civil rights. And those civil rights, by the way, include not just only African Americans, but the LGBT community.
But Vice President Biden, do you agree today that you were wrong to oppose busing in America then?
No.
Do you agree?
I did not oppose busing in America. What I opposed is busing ordered by the Department of Education. That's what I opposed.
Well, there was a failure of states to integrate public schools in America. I was part of the second class to integrate Berkeley, California public schools almost 2 decades after Brown v. Board of Education.
Because your city council made that decision. It was a local decision.
So that's where the federal government must step in. That's why we have the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. That's why we need to pass the Equality Act. That's why we need to pass the ERA, because there are moments in history where states fail to preserve the civil rights of all people.
I have supported the ERA from the very beginning when I ran for the
Vice President Biden, 30 seconds, because I want to bring other people into this.
I supported the ERA from the very beginning. I'm the guy that extended the Voting Rights Act for 25 years. We got to the place where we got 98 out of 98 votes in the United States Senate doing it. I've also argued very strongly that we, in fact, deal with the notion of denying people access to the ballot box. I agree that everybody, once they, in fact, they should. Anyway, my time's up. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Vice President.
All of these things.
In this table, we see almost too much information. Those of you who are statistically inclined can go through this in greater detail. But ultimately, we tested 5 hypotheses regarding visual priming and framing using 4 different ways of measuring electoral status. The first 2 hypotheses regarded visual priming, where we looked at total screen time and mean camera fixation time. What we found was that, with our first hypothesis, that all measures of electoral status significantly predicted the amount of time a candidate was shown. But the most powerful variable was not as we expected from our 2016 study. Instead of being one of the top 2 candidates driving camera time, it was how close to the middle of the stage a candidate was. Here, being in the 2 center spots meant having 28 minutes of screen time, with each move to the outside leading to 3.5 minutes less camera time. In other words, being center stage matters. We found the same thing for average amount of camera time on a candidate at any one period of time. Here, being center stage meant more time was spent focused on the candidate by the camera, regardless of the debate night. The next 3 hypotheses considered time spent in solo shots, with high status candidates expected to have more time in this frame. And likewise, we expected higher status candidates to spend more time in the side-by-side camera shots. We finally expected lower status candidates to spend more time in multi-candidate shots. When we consider head and shoulders solo shots, we find that only the top tier position electoral status played a significant role, with being a top 4 candidate associated with having roughly 6% more camera time in the shot than all the other lower tier candidates. So, again, the lessons of 2016 did not hold up in 2020. Not surprisingly, given the relative lack of time spent in the 2 shot, whether split screen or side by side, we did not find any significant results. But what we did find was that in multi-candidate shots, being low in the polls led to a greater proportion of time in this shot. So what we can conclude is that the 2020 initial debates were quite different from those in 2016 in visual priming and visual framing. Whether this was due to there being fewer easily recognizable candidates than in 2016, or lessons learned by the networks, visual priming and visual framing were quantitatively more equal. In other words, production decisions were arguably normatively fairer. This does not mean that putting 10 candidates on stage is the best approach. Indeed, a strong argument might be made for either raising the barriers to entry onto the debate stage to limit the amount of candidates, or to find another way to increase public scrutiny. Regardless, choosing leaders based upon media attention may lead to a mismatch in the leaders we think we want and the leaders that we actually need.